Hi, I'm Daisy Lee of Radiant Lotus Qigong. I'm so excited and honored to introduce you to my friend Damo Mitchell, who is joining us all the way from Thailand. Damo is the director of Lotus Gong School of Internal Arts and founder of the Internal Arts Academy online. Damo began his training in the internal arts at the age of 4. Since that time, he has traveled across Europe, America, China, Southeast Asia, and teaching these arts, as well as continuing in his search for masters of authentic spiritual traditions. Damo's teachings in martial arts, Chinese medicine, and Neigong and Qigong are passed down through the Lotus Gong School and through his books on the Taoist arts. Welcome, Damo.
Hi, Daisy. Thank you for having me here.
It's a pleasure. I'm so happy that you're able to join us. You know, one of the amazing things, your ability to properly digest and analyze and also synthesize what you've learned is what makes you such an inspirational and really enlightened teacher. And that's both in Qigong and Neigong. So you've been able to essentially decode the essence and deeper layers of meaning within these ancient practices. And really to go beyond the surface movements to share the profound wisdom within these practices. So I've always had great respect and admiration for what you do and how you teach. You know, we always talk about the foundations of Jing, Qi, and Shen in these arts, but I wanted to focus especially on what may be the most misunderstood, which is Jing. Can you help us understand the nature of Jing and how it relates to sexual energy in Qigong?
Yeah, sure. I agree with you completely. I think that, well, first of all, thank you for the lovely introduction. That's very nice of you. I don't know if I've managed to fully comprehend all these things anywhere near as deep as you can go myself, but I'll try and help, sure. Yeah, I agree with you. I think Jing is probably the most misunderstood out of the three, which is actually a bit of a surprise because I think most people would assume Shen is the most understood, but I think Jing, I think it's also important that we understand what it is, because obviously generally in Qigong or in Neigong, especially, or alchemy, it's the first of the treasures that's generally supposed to be worked with. Usually, like a foundation is built there on kind of bottom-up systems, isn't it? Yes, I mean, Jing is... Can I step back, actually, before that? Let's look at this. There's a concept that applies to Jing, Qi, certainly all of the energies within the body that I think helped me to understand it, like what was key, really. And it took me a long time to get that, was that within the Chinese arts, especially anything around Taoism or alchemy or Qigong, was that really that any component, any of the treasures, such as Jing, is really comprised of two parts, which are put together and work as one. And you can kind of call them, I suppose, to simplify it, one would be the kind of tangible aspect of this treasure, so the tangible aspect of Jing, and then the other side would be the consciousness aspect of that treasure, and the two kind of come together to work as one. So Jing, as much as anything, is something that has form, has structure, has a location, but also has consciousness and non-location and non-form at the same time. And I think especially for Western minds, or certainly I can talk for myself, that was a difficult concept to get my mind around at first, that something can be a thing and a no thing at the same time, and then there's no contradiction in that. And I think that a lot of people, if they can make that leap to understanding that concept, then something like Jing is much easier to start to understand. That's the kind of the basis of it for me. Because within something like Qigong or alchemy, both aspects of the Jing need to be understood. So first of all, the kind of tangible experiential side of it, but we also have to understand the basis of the consciousness that sits behind it. And obviously for Jing, the consciousness there is to do with base desires, not just sexuality, but that's a large part of it, but base desires such as survival needs, desires, fears, these kind of things are very much connected to the Jing as well. I mean, in Chinese medicine, the kidneys, the essence of fear are closely related, not just our kind of sexual drive. So Jing is often translated as the essence, and I think that's a very clever word. I think essence is a very clever word, because I think sometimes the English translations are they're a bit woolly sometimes, a little bit, maybe a little bit off the mark. But I think essence is a good one, because not only does it contain the potential, kind of the blueprints, the essence for our health, but it also contains the essence of who we are as a person on our kind of most base level as well. And I think that's really, for me, a key understanding of Jing, because how we refine it is only done by changing the base nature of who we are. That's the key behind Jing. So sometimes people will talk about just techniques, mechanical techniques to kind of consolidate this energy or draw it from the kidneys into the circulation of the body, or there's all kinds of techniques with it. But ultimately, more importantly at that, is the confrontation we have to have with the psychology that sits behind the Jing. Because one of the key principles that they discuss for the essence or the Jing is that it must be settled. That's all, settled, not stimulated, settled. Yeah, and that's
interesting. Yeah, because that's probably one of the big misunderstandings, is that people are thinking of this essence as semen, like the physical fluids of the body. And so that's where the confusion begins, because they think it's about sex, as opposed to about the deeper layers. And that's where I think it would be really enlightening to hear your understanding. How do you demysticize that misunderstanding, so that people know how do you use this energy? What exactly is this Jing?
Okay, I mean, before we go into that, that's a really interesting question. That's a big question as well, Daisy. It could be here for about 5 hours, you realize. But I think the first thing we should look at really is you've got to remember that spiritual practitioners, because I'm always coming from the position of someone who's interested, I guess, in meditation and spirituality more than anything else. And Qigong to me would be an adjunct to that, to assist with the kind of spiritual process. That would be the position I'm coming from, so people understand my perspective. You've got to remember that sex was never a part of the spiritual path. In fact, it was seen as actually almost counter to the spiritual path in some ways, or rather the attachment to people had to that side of their life. So people didn't have to be celibate, but there is a kind of distortion on the teachings of Jing. And I don't want to go into a kind of history lesson, but it's something that I looked at extensively to try to understand. And is it okay with a little bit of history, a tiny bit as to
yes.
why? Keep it
yes,
brief.
I think that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, I won't make it really extensive, but essentially what you had was early writings and teachings on the nature of Jing and its connection to sexuality. And really we could call this kind of sexual health teachings as much as anything, if we equate it to something we have in the West. So a lot of the kind of teachings around there were about moderation versus too much sexual activity. And then also about just general sexual health. So you get all these fun things within the writings about how to understand the nature of a partner's essence, from how they look and the shape of their body and their odor and all sorts of things like this. But it was kind of early sexual hygiene. And then what you have is a mixing of the two, kind of alchemical terminology of Jing and these kind of early sexual hygiene books kind of coming together. And then you have a cult kind of appeared within Qigong, which I'm often surprised people don't talk about more, but there was a cult of immortality that appeared, where concepts of spiritual immortality and the idea of physical immortality kind of blended, and the lines became sort of hard to see where one ended and one began. Spiritual practitioners were talking about spiritual immortality, but ultimately let's be honest, the wealthy, the rich, were talking about physical immortality, because thousands of years ago, hundreds of years ago, poor people probably didn't want to live in a life of suffering for millennia after millennia, but the people who had all the money and the power did. So they started to gather around them teachers and mystics and Taoists to come to the, I suppose you call it the court, wouldn't you, the kind of emperor's court, to teach them how to be immortal. So what happened was they took some of the alchemical teachings and they mixed it with something that was a large part of the emperor's life, which was sexuality. and created a kind of cult around the idea of you don't really need to do spiritual work. You just need to refine this substance within the body. And if you can hold on to it, eventually you will then attain immortality. And from here, there was further evolutions of the teachings that went off in a direction that most Taoist alchemists would actually consider deviant. And I know that's an unpopular view, and I apologize, but those deviant teachings went on to form the majority of the kind of sexual practices within Qigong. So I think that as much as anything, with regards to the sexual side of Qigong, you've got a kind of double-edged sword here. You've got a bit of a problem because it can be used to understand how to hold a healthy relationship. That's true. And a healthy, intimate relationship, and also how to have sex with a partner so that you both support each other's energies. That's true. I think that's a very positive side of it. But on the other hand, if there's no refinement of the consciousness around Jing, then actually this whole concept of sexual energy for spiritual refinement becomes, well, literally, according to classical definitions, a poison that taints the heart. This was the phrase that they used. So sexual practice for spiritual development was actually shunned as an idea alchemically.
Oh, how interesting. From what I've seen that has been popularized is that essentially, especially for men, they've kind of reduced it to save as much as you can of your essence, quote essence, and don't let it go anywhere too far, like it's a stray that's going to run away. And you bottle it up so that you can live forever. That's like, in a very quick summary, that there's this perception of that. And that's where I feel if there's a mistaken impression, a lot of it has to do with that. Yes. A lot of people will focus on just desire and just the sensuality of practice, as opposed to how to cultivate the spirit, how to refine one's energy so that, yes, the body is healthier, but what then? What goes beyond just that? And so, yes, there's the longevity piece, but I know you studied and understood it in a way that is, I think, healthier for the majority to really get the depth of understanding for this. And so, if someone is practicing Neigong, or can they also practice Qigong and use these same understandings?
Yeah, completely. I mean, for most teachers, they're interchangeable terms anyway, aren't they? Qigong and Neigong quite often. It's only that I use them to talk about, I guess, different approaches to the same subject as much as anything, but still the basic teachings are going to be the same. I mean, with regards to Jing, as I just remembered the other question you asked me actually about sexual fluids, didn't you? I apologize. I'm sorry. You have to remember, look alchemically at how they depict Jing within the body. They draw it as trigrams, right, from the I Ching, and at the base of the body, they draw the water trigram, which is two yin lines with a solid yang line in the middle. It's Kan, the symbol for water, down the base of the body. And that really is the essence for both Qigong and Neigong, how to cultivate the Jing. Because what they're showing you is there's two components to the Jing, and also there is more yin than yang within the essence, but still there is a spark of yang in the center, a spark of yang essence, that solid yang line. And that's what needs refining. Now, what you are withholding when you withhold the essence in Qigong ultimately are the yin lines, which is the substance and the fluid of the Jing. But funnily enough, and this is going to be probably the most unusual for some people with my opinion on it, is those yin lines, the substance of the Jing isn't derived from the kidneys, not really, and isn't particularly something that we need to hold on to, because it's largely created by the food and the fluids that we eat. So when you eat and when you drink and your body processes that, it produces the substance. What comes from the kidneys is the yang line, that little spark, and they call it the Jing Hua. It means the kind of most refined part of the Jing. And that energy, that potential for life that sits there within the essence is what should be extracted from the Jing and then used for Qigong or Neigong practice for spiritual cultivation. Okay, that's the thing that is refined, that is sent up through the nervous system and into the brain and through the endocrine system. But the key is how to separate that yang line from the yin lines. And that's the thing that's very, very tricky. And that's what Qigong and Neigong teachings were focused on, really, on that.
So how does one begin that process? Because some people might think, well, if it's a spiritual kind of process, it is one thing, but actually your practices are very physical, in terms of how to mobilize the lines of the body, and so much more than that. I'll let you share on that.
I think we have to remember that the mechanics of something like this, the extraction from the essence, are only going to work if the yang spark is there to be extracted. If the essence from the Jing is ready to be extracted, then it can be taken. Otherwise, your mechanical methods are not really going to do anything. You're going to be trying to draw upon something that's empty. And in order to extract it, that is a consciousness-based practice. It's to do with your mindset. So the cultivation of the mind with regards to Jing has to come first in order for it to be there to be extracted. So you can have all the mechanical methods in the world, but if your mindset is not correct, it won't be taken. And the key to it to understand is that yang spark is mobilized and used every single time you are sexually aroused. If you're just going to focus on sexuality, like if you're not focusing on the other things Jing does, just sexuality, every time you are aroused, that yang spark is then used up. It's no longer able to be extracted. So it's not ejaculation, it's not orgasm, it's arousal that disturbs that yang spark. So one of the key things we need to do from a consciousness level is learn how to disconnect from that part of our consciousness. And that becomes a very unpopular teaching. But obviously, pretty much every religion or spiritual tradition has been talking about this for generations. I can't think of a single spiritual tradition that pushed the view of being overtly sexual at all times. And it's not something that we see from that sort of side of life from the spiritual traditions, really, is it?
Right. And that's what you meant when you said to settle the energy, to settle the Jing, as opposed to, put it out there, trying to find an elegant way to say it.
To achieve normality with regards to sexuality, which is something that it's like you can't rise above normality until you're normal. And I know normal is a loaded word because that's very subjective, isn't it? But according to spiritual teachings, it would be to separate yourself from deviance, would be the kind of basis of it. So I think with regards to this day and age, one of the hardest reasons, or the most difficult reasons that people can't refine their Jing is because we live in an age of over sexuality that's in our face at all times. And I don't want to use a sort of religiously insulting sounding word, but kind of deviant behavior. And I mean by people's darker psychological traits coming out during sexual intimacy, which is something that acupuncture patients speak, or Chinese medical patients speak to me about, students speak to me about, especially young girls, the negative experiences they've had, and things like this. These distortions on the subject of sexuality need to be normalized before you can even start to kind of pull yourself away from these kind of base desires so that the Jing can be extracted in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I think if people are going to talk about sexual practice in spirituality, I think that's more valid than anything else, rather than learning to be multi-orgasmic or restraining your essence or something. More important is, can you separate your sexuality from the deviant or darker parts of your psychology so they can part, so that it can settle and you can be normal. And then it's possible to maybe begin that work with the Jing, I think.
Right. And also you mentioned that the food and drink that you take in is also going to affect the Jing. Yeah. And your cultivation ultimately.
Yes. Yeah. Health and personal cultivation must come together, of course, for everything to work as it needs to. As my
yes. very much so. Yeah, I hope that in sharing this, new approach, I'm not sure it's actually new, it's actually probably very ancient, and just has been misunderstood or maligned over the years. And so there is this tendency with media and maybe even advertising of Qigong that it can skew into a certain direction, and it might attract people, um, as the advertisers know, it's what has drawn sex and rock and roll, is what draws people. But it may not be the honest way of doing cultivation.
It's easy to sell.
Yeah. And so, do you, how do you approach this? How do you share with your students? What is the way to go about kind of decoding this information that's out there, and kind of taking the charge, the veneer, the veneer of this misunderstanding about Jing, so that it's actually presented in the proper way?
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult, but I think as much as anything, I know this is going to be an simple answer, but even if you just look at the literature, purely the literature, if we take away teachings or methods or lineages or anything like this, because of course you can pass on what you're taught, but you can divide the literature into two piles: classical literature, which largely talks about the refinement of self and the settling of base desires to pull yourself away from these problems, and then contemporary literature, which is as much as anything about how to withhold your semen and have as much sex as you can, and that energy will rise up and you'll enter into a blissful state of enlightenment. But there's a separation between the two. They don't discuss the same thing. They definitely don't.
How does one separate and distinguish how to use this?
Well, I would first of all say, look at who wrote it. Who wrote it? What was the achievement of the person that wrote it? As long as we're taking on faith, which I suppose there is an aspect to it, that the people who wrote the classical texts of that time were of a certain stage of realization, in the same way that a Buddhist has to ultimately go on faith that the Buddha was awakened and to sort of higher states than a non-practitioner. That if you look at the stages of attainment of the people that wrote those classics versus the contemporary writer who is purporting these ideas that it's just about circulation of Jing through the channels and sort of muscular contractions and things like this, to me, that's a no-brainer. As much as anything, that's a no-brainer. And then secondly, experience. Experience. Once you have a group of people that you're helping to teach, I don't like to say students, it kind of implies kind of ownership on some level, you know what I mean? But people that you're working with, once you can get them to see how much more settled the mind is when they're divided a little bit from that side of their life, even for a short period of time, they will see. It doesn't mean that sexuality is removed from your life, not at all, but it naturally moves to a level of harmony and balance and regulation that is much more settling for the mind, healthier for the body, healthier for relationships, healthier with life. And then also that base part of your nature, the animal part of your nature, if you like, which I know it's a loaded word there, but your animal nature is kind of, I suppose, refined and risen above, and then something else can be experienced. Because ultimately, if you're going to just keep drawing up your base nature over and over again, your base nature, your instinctual nature, your desire-based nature, once that starts to merge with your Shen, your spirit, then it's not going to produce the results that we wish for with regards to awakening, right? Mm-hmm. Not really. It's kind of like mixing the turbid and the pure, according to classical literature. And I think people will experience that for themselves after a while.
Do you know if it takes a long time? Like, what would you say if there was a timeline? How long does it take in your practice to actually feel the first level, I guess you could say, of cultivation? Do you notice more peace or kind of different resonance?
It depends on the person. I think it's very individual. Some people very fast, some people very, very quick, some people a lot longer. But I think if we're focusing just on this area of sexuality around Jing, then I think it really depends on where they are mentally and what influences they've had. So if I were being honest, I would say that right now, I'm going to sound like a right old fart, aren't I? But younger people are struggling with this a great deal more, because a lot of them have been, I'm too old, I didn't grow up with it, but a lot of younger people now grew up with constant pornography on this thing they carry around with them all the time. And I'm quite surprised at how much and from what age and how often they've been consuming these kinds of images and things like this. So I think it is getting more and more difficult, because imagery, desire, energy is all kind of tangled up into this mess for a lot of people that needs to be separated and divided out. And I'm a big fan of retreats for that reason, lengthy retreats away from stuff, not a weekend, not a week. I think for people who want to change this part of the nature, there's nothing else for it, but you need to lift them out of society for a while, plonk them there in the forest, in the desert, wherever you're taking them, and to have that space to separate from it. And I think most people will start to notice the settling, the change.
Yeah, fantastic. I feel like there's this period in time in our history is really quite fraught with intense emotions. And and there's so much division and conflict. And
Yes.
so, people use their energy in such a way that they just like they use it as a form of release, sexual energy as a form of release. But if you're on the path of cultivation, you have to find that balance, right?
Yes. Yeah, for sure. I mean, a spiritual cultivator shouldn't really be using a quick form of release, almost like a Band-Aid or a sticky plaster for something anyway. I mean, that's kind of the point of spiritual cultivation, is to look at what is the underlying nature of that cause for conflict or concern in the first place. And personally, I think, aside from all the suffering and difficulty that's happened around the world, people getting sick and losing their lives and protests and all of these things going on at the moment, it has been a wonderful time for cultivation for many people who are involved in this, because you are subjected to isolation away from the world. In many cases, which is what I've done during this period, I've just disappeared off, focused on cultivation. And secondly, I think during periods of great emotional division, I think that really shows you where you are in your practice. It's a slap in the face for what is your cultivation.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I've noticed that as well, is that I know, not that I want to wish any of this on anyone, but I've certainly felt like these last two plus years have been, for me at least, a time of really going into nature, doing practice, and, infusing myself with all the energies that are around me from nature. And that has been actually a luxury. So I feel for a lot of students and friends that have gone through some difficulty, but this certainly has been, a helpful time for me.
Also, like me, Daisy, you've been teaching a lot, and it's tiring, Daisy, isn't it? It's great.
It's one of those things, when you're doing it, you love it. And yet there's this other side where, to be fully present, you have to be, you're on, in a sense. There's a mental shift that happens, an internal shift. And teaching is different than doing like your own practice.
Yes. Yeah. I even find you can't do and teach at the same time. Unfortunately, maybe some people can, but it's difficult. So I still have to practice while teaching. And I think that, like the rest of the day when I'm not, it's a very exhausting thing. But I
I have to agree with that. And I have to say, I really love my students and care about them and want to be like 100% present. But when I'm finished teaching, it's a whole other thing where I go into my isolation of a sort and do my own work. And somehow nature is a big part of it for me here in Puerto Rico. So you travel a lot now.
Yes, well, that's never changed. Yeah, I'm always on the road. Yeah, that's no different. I think I've traveled just as much during this period as other times, to be perfectly honest. I've just been traveling in slightly quieter places as much as anything, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic that you're in balance and really using all your techniques that you share with others. So I on that note, I wonder if you could share a practice with us.
Seated is the easiest way, essentially, to work with Jing. But if you need to sit on a chair, that's okay, it's no problem. But it's better to have the hips open if you're capable, and better to be on the floor. I know I'm sat on a couch, but that's for practicality for the video, but the floor would be better. Spine upright. And we want this base with anything with around the subject of Jing anyway, because the base when you're sitting kind of increases the density on the bottom of the body anyway, as much as anything else, the opening of the hips do so. Hands can just be rested either on top of each other or on the knees, generally in the lap. It doesn't really matter. It's not a mudra-based practice particularly. So spine upright, lightly close the eyes, and just allow the body to breathe in and out of its own accord. Don't try to change it or do anything. We'll just say, let the body breathe in and out a few times. Just let everything settle. Try to relax the shoulders. Let the unnecessary tension fall away. Again, just let the body breathe. Now, what I'll show you here is just a simple breathing exercise, as much as anything, just to help to warm the region of the Jing down at the base of the body around the perineum. But remember from what I was saying that this is a mechanic of the Jing. It's a method, but you still need the mental cultivation. And ultimately, as much as anything, that will depend upon you. It's about learning to settle and allow the Jing to sink and settle by moving away from those desires. So it's calm, it's peace, it's not aroused, it's not excited, it's just simply settled. And this is the time for this kind of practice, when everything just feels placid. Then what I'm going to start to do is I'm just going to change my breath a little bit. And this can be a little tricky, but if you don't overthink it, you'll get it for sure. What I do is I breathe in through the nose. And then when I breathe out, I'm going to direct my breath down inside towards the perineum, which I know sounds like a strange instruction because the air is coming out of your nostrils, obviously. But I'm just going to direct the breath down on the exhalation. So I breathe out and down in a line through the body towards the perineum. And then when I breathe in, I just allow my body to breathe in of its own accord naturally. And then when I breathe out, again, I direct that breath down through the center of the body towards the perineum, towards the base of the body. And the strength of it is almost like you've got sort of glowing embers in a campfire. And if you blow too hard, you get a face full of ash, right? So it's just a gentle, long, slow exhalation, breathing down through the center of the body towards the perineum. And we're going to do this for maybe just 3 or 4 minutes. Just trying to direct that down inside, gently, long and slow. Allow the yi, the awareness, to just be guided by the movement through the inside. You'll find it'll be led down towards the perineum of its own accord. So long, slow exhalation down through the center of the body, blowing on the embers of the fire. And in a minute, I'll add another part. Okay, so just continue with that. So the more the Jing settles, when I breathe down through the inside of the body, the base of the body, the perineum, starts to get stimulated by the breath. So it's quite normal for there to be warmth or just an increase of sensation, sometimes a bit tickly, actually, at first. Your perineum tickled, it's maybe not something you want, but it just feels like it's kind of stimulated down in that area. If there is a lot of unhealthy connection to the Jing, it's almost like a marker to that side of your nature, you can actually become sexually aroused, or sexual images will come into the mind, or sometimes a feeling of fear. So if that is there, you need to understand that you have maybe a little bit of an unconscious connection to the Jing that we want to step away from a little bit. Relax, release that connection and step back till it's comfortable and just warm. If you have a strong deficiency in the kidneys, it's quite normal for there to be a slight bruised feeling in the back to arise at this time around the lumbar, but don't worry, this isn't going to exacerbate it. It's simply showing you that when I touch the Jing, this is the quality of the condition here. So you might want to seek out a Chinese medicine practitioner and get them to help you with your kidney strength, some herbs or whatever they might do. If you can breathe down, and there is now just the stimulation, the warmth in that area, it feels pleasant, then what we're going to do is we're going to start to breathe in, and we're going to draw that inwards. So on the exhalation, we breathe down, and on the inhalation, I'm very gently just going to close the abdominal cavity, very, very gently, like reverse abdominal breathing, but a lazy version of. Okay, it's very, very subtle. So as I inhale, I let the abdominal space just gently close, ever so small. You're not even sure you're doing it, maybe a millimeter or two. And then as I breathe out, I direct the breath down from above. So you've got a two-part process. I breathe in, I draw that space closed from the inside. Don't use the external muscles, your abdominal wall or anything. Just draw the space closed ever so gently, and then breathe out, direct the breath down inside. Okay, just try this. So long, slow inhalation, gently being the key. Don't crush your guts. Gently close that space ever so slightly, so small you don't know if you're doing it. And then breathe out and direct the breath down inside towards the perineum. Your hands can just stay resting in the lap. I'm just showing you with my hands the movement you want. Breathing in, hands come together. Breathing out, directing the breath down inside, okay? So now the Jing is stimulated and then directed towards the center of the lower cavity. the abdominal space, essentially. Nice and soft. Always think of Jing or Qi, really. It's like a fine silk thread that's easy to break. If you kind of pull it, there's a subtlety to it. You just want to tug it, but I don't want to snap it yet. Very, very gentle. And obviously I'm doing a shorter version of this practice because of time constraints. But if you carry on for some time, 20 minutes, half hour, maybe something like this, you'll find that the heat for most people after a while will start to change into almost like a menthol feel. It's like heat, but you know what menthol is like. Is it hot? Is it cold? You're not sure. It moves through that area. And this will start to be essentially that the Jing is starting to consolidate within that space. Okay. So just a couple more minutes, maybe. Breathe in. Gently, 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 gently close that space. Breathe out. Direct the breath down inside towards that point at the bottom of the body. And we'll sit for a couple of minutes together, not too long. Because Daisy's a busy lady. Okay, then we'll just bring the hands around, bring them up. And not much time to explain this, but just bring the hands with a slight gap between the crown and the hands, okay, just above. And I just gently, so I've got Bai Hui, crown of the head, Lao Gong, and the other Lao Gong, lean a little so you can see, with a gap between them. And I'm just going to gently stretch the palm, just a little bit. And those of you with a little bit of training will feel something pressurized down into the dantian area a little bit. And I'm just going to bring those hands down, facing my center line with a gap between them. Just pulling gently down towards the abdomen. I just rest the hands here. Take a couple of deep breaths in and out through the nose, like you're stretching the lungs. A bit more assertive than you would usually. Just to oxygenate the body a little bit, stretch the ribs. Okay, and then your best thing to do afterwards, realistically, if you've built successfully any kind of consolidation of this feeling, this mental feeling, is then to go and move the body somehow. Tai Chi, Qigong exercises, or a walk around in the woods, whatever you want to do, just to mobilize that energy through the body so it can nourish the body a little bit. And if you want to practice this, like I say, gentle is the key. Really, really gentle. Don't suck everything in, just very, very soft. At times when you're calm, not stimulated, you don't want TV around because that'll disturb the Jing, media, music, very, very calm. Best place to be, in my opinion, would be out in nature to allow the, well, for me, it's forests, but everyone has their own preference, don't they? But that kind of scenery for me just helps to settle everything and establish the mindset I want for this practice to make it more efficient. It's just a very standard Jing consolidation method for within alchemy from the northern traditions, essentially. So hopefully that'll help you get a feel for your Jing, some of you.
That was fabulous, Damo. I really appreciate it. I could definitely feel, this gentle warmth coming through the central channel into the lower abdomen. So thank you for that. And I'm sure so many people will get so much from that. It's the subtlety, as you were saying, that's where the magic happens.
Yeah, for sure. Forced technique are never good for your health.
Very true. Damo, do you want to share any last thoughts, or are there upcoming programs or books in the works?
Well, for last thoughts, I would like to add that I never want to be an inflammatory character. That's not something I wish to be. And I know that a lot of people have a different view on Jing and sexual practices. And obviously I know sexual Qigong is a thing a lot of people are very interested in. But I would like just to point out that it's because I come from the position of a spiritual cultivator that's interested very much in alchemy and that side of the tradition. That's why. So my perspective comes from there. And from that perspective, I will always take this view. That's why. But I know other people come from different perspectives and have different interests. So I never want to fly in the face of what people enjoy doing. Definitely not. And the other thing is I don't actually like to advertise myself, as you probably, I'm aware from the way you asked me, you're probably aware actually, Daisy, the way you asked it. Yeah, it's okay. If people want to find me, they'll find me, I always think. And if not, then I will disappear into the ether.
Thank you so much, Damo. It's a real pleasure and an honor to spend time with you and tap into all that incredible wisdom you have within you. So thank you for that. And thank you also, everyone, for tuning in to this really fantastic teacher. And I know, since you're not going to say it, damomitchell.com or lotusnegong.com, amongst another Chinese medicine college one as well. But you can find that on the website. So I look forward to next time. And thank you again, Damo, so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's really nice. Thank you very much, Daisy. Thank you.